Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Sternsches. I'm Director of Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Toronto. And I am beyond excited to welcome you to our first since COVID international conference in person. I mean, and what topic it is. So, first, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been a traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, I will keep my remarks to a bare minimum of 45 minutes. So I just want to say that there were many people involved in making this conference possible, and I want to take a moment to thank them. First of all, it's our first, not just the first in-person conference, but also our first Himel family conference in Jewish studies. Andrew and Sharon Himel are not here yet, but they will come later, and I want to express the gratitude for their vision and for the support of this event. This Himel family of endowment will support international conferences in the field of Jewish studies, and we're looking forward to working on it and bringing the cutting edge scholarship again to the Center for Jewish Studies here. I also would like to extend a special thank you to Renee Lefkovich, who I haven't, you're Renee, right? It's so good to see you in person after like 5 years of phone call and conversations. And it's thanks to Renee's vision and ideas, we actually started thinking about this conference and thinking about Joanna Tokarska-Bakir here. We're so excited that you made it to Toronto despite the quarantines and all the obstacles that that are on our way. So Renee, welcome to Toronto, and it's very good to see you here. Our other supporters are Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, History Department, Konstantin Reinhardt, Chair of Polish History, Chancellor Rosen Ray-Wolf, Chair of Holocaust Studies, and Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship from Ottawa. So the brain behind this event and the initiative and the vision, of course, belong to my colleague, Professor Piotr Wróbel, who is modestly standing right beside me. He is the organizer of this event. He came up with the ideas of how to work it, how to build it, the themes we're going to cover, and invited our esteemed speakers who all accepted that invitation despite travel measures, and travel measures were in place in Canada up until a day before yesterday. So we're very excited that you made it, and we're honored as well. Professor Wróbel will introduce our panel in a more detailed way, but I do want to say that he himself is a fancy schmancy scholar. I should say what's written here. Holds a Konstantin Reinhardt Chair in Polish Studies at the University of Toronto. Is an affiliated member of the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies and the History Department. He's the author or co-author of 7 books and more than 75 articles about Polish, German, Belarusian, and Jewish history that are published in Poland, Great Britain, United States, and of course, Canada. And he's also currently a member of the advisory board of the journal Polin Studies and in Polish Jewry. And I do want to say also that thanks to Professor Wróbel, we have today one of the most robust programs in East European Jewish studies in the world, am I allowed to say in the world, with people teaching here, with Piotr leading the way in Polish Jewish studies here at the University of Toronto, but also having strength in modern Jewish history, Yiddish studies, Jewish literature, and all this. And it's a pleasure and honor to work with Piotr in training our graduate and undergraduate students, and also welcome the audience like yourself. So today we have a busy day. We'll have 3 morning lectures by Professor Gross, Grabowski, and Tokarska-Bakir. And then at 4 o'clock, we're joining for a panel where all of our speakers, including Professor Rubel, will discuss the issues of the Holocaust studies in Poland today. And that session will be moderated by Professor Bergen, our Rosen Wolf Professor in Holocaust Studies. So now, without any more remarks, please welcome Professor Rubel, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much. Let me add to this that Professor Sternschiss is the director of the largest Center for Jewish Studies on this continent. I don't know how about the world, because there is the state of Israel, obviously, but we are still bigger. So this is, the center is huge. And also, I used to have many students, graduate students, doing all kinds of fields, including Ukrainian history and Polish history and Belarusian history. All of them come to the center to collaborate here, to do something together with Professor Sternschiss and the staff. So thank you again for organizing this. Many people were involved here, and thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Constance. Thank you, Galina. Thank you for your help. All right, the plan is as follows. We will have 3 lectures now before 1 o'clock. Then we will have lunch, and then as Professor Sternschiss said, between 4 and 6 we will have the final panel. Our first presenter is Professor Gross. You have heard the name, so but I have to introduce him anyway. So Professor Gross is Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, where he held 2 professorships, as a matter of fact, and now he's kind of double Professor Emeritus. He was born in Warsaw. He studied physics at the University of Warsaw, but then in 1968, because he was involved in student dissident movement and for other reasons, he was expelled from the University of Warsaw and spent 5 months in jail. In 1969, he emigrated to the United States. He earned a PhD at Yale, and his PhD thesis was published several years later as Polish Society under German occupation. Very interesting text, very good for the students, as a matter of fact, for various reasons. And then Professor Gross taught at New York University, Emory, Yale, and several universities in Paris, Vienna, and Krakow. Professor Gross published many books and very numerous articles, but I would say probably his most important achievement are the neighbors, the destruction of the Jewish community in Jedwabne, Poland. Why I think so? Because the book became the turning point in Polish historiography devoted to the Holocaust studies. So people used to write things before Gross and after Gross. And after Gross, things were very different. The Gross, the book stimulated the largest public debate in Poland after the fall of communism in Poland. And some sociologists tried to check how many people in Poland in the 1990s had not heard about Gross and the neighbors. And the results was 2%. Had never heard about Gross, but 98 had. So this is an important book. To me, this is an important book too. And I have to say that I kind of, how to say it, I struggle with the book all the time. I read it, reread it, and read again. But then after Neighbors, Professor Gross published Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz. And finally, the trilogy was completed in 2012 with Golden Harvest, which he published with Irena Grudzińska-Gross. The full title is Golden Harvest: Events at the periphery of the Holocaust. He published, obviously, many other books. As a matter of fact, my favorite one, leaving aside the trilogy, is The Revolution from Abroad, the Soviet conquest of Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. This is my favorite book, and I use it with students all the time. Professor Gross was awarded the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, which is really something. And now, among Polish scholars or armchair historians, there isn't a case that someone would not know the name. This is Professor Gross. I think these are the most important things. The chair is yours. You have about 1 hour. We hope that you will talk for a shorter time than 1 hour, and then probably we will be able to squeeze some questions by the end of this hour. However, please remember, in the afternoon, you will perform again during the panels. Professor Gross, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for these wonderful words of introduction. It's embarrassing and very difficult to live up to the setup. I'm going to talk about the book Neighbors mostly, but in a bizarre way. As you will see, just weave into it. And before I do so, just for those of you who are not deeply involved in studying the history of the Second World War, I just want to say 3 sentences. In 1939, Poland has been occupied, attacked by 2 enemy powers. First by the Third Reich, Hitler's Third Reich, on September 1st, and then on September 17th, this was a result of an agreement between Hitler and Stalin by the Soviet Union. And the country was divided in half for the first 20 months. And Jedwabne was in the Soviet zone of occupation, just almost at the very border. It would be taken over by the Germans on the first day when they initiated and began their war against the Soviet Union. As the saying goes, books have their own destinies. Habent sua fata libelli, and Neighbors, I must confess, had one, which I could not have anticipated. Eventually, the book got translated into 13 languages. It was read widely and debated extensively, nowhere more so than in Poland. Alongside criticism, accompanied at times with acerbic personal attacks against the author, Neighbors also received its share of acclaim. In the end, it did not win any major prize, but was shortlisted for a couple of important distinctions in the publishing world: the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award in the United States, and the main literary prize in Poland, the Nike Award. A few years after the book's publication in 2005, when Princeton University Press celebrated its own centenary, it listed Neighbors among the 100 books the press treasured most. A small poster issued on this occasion included my photograph from the back cover of the hardback edition, a photo taken by my daughter, which I like very much, together with many clever and sympathetic faces of Princeton's authors, including the likeness of Albert Einstein. It won't surprise you when I confess that this was the recognition that I treasure most. After all, how many of us can say that they have been in a photo together with Einstein? But enough of self-praise. Let me now get into the gist of today's lecture and try to place Neighbors in the context of historical writings about the Holocaust and my own work as a historian. I had been publishing books about the experience of the Second World War in Poland under both the German and the Soviet occupation for 25 years before I wrote Nameless. Of course, I could not have written it until I came across the requisite documentation. But the reasons for the delay were also deeper, rooted in the manner historians were writing at the time about the war and the Shoah. It may seem highly conceivable nowadays, when books about various aspects of the Holocaust are published in abundance, that the mass murder of European Jews was in post-war, post-World War II decades, a subject shunned by scholars. The reasons for it, in my judgment, were multiple, having to do not only with the difficulty of contemplating the enormity of crimes committed, but also, I suspect, with the reluctance to confront different shades of complicity in Nazi-engineered evil by peoples and institutions in German-occupied Europe. With elegant restraint in his magisterial study, Scholl Friedlander put it thus, and I'm quoting, "Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of the flock up to a point. To the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, and this sentence is underlined by the author, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests." Unquote. For much of the war, another historian had written, and I am quoting now from a book by a distinguished student of wartime Europe, Mark Mazower, "For much of the war, Europeans fell into line and contributed what the Germans demanded anyway. After 1945, this was conveniently forgotten." Unquote. This, I presume, must have had initially a chilling effect on academic engagement with the Shoah. In any case, it took a long time before extermination of the Jews emerged as a widely pursued subject of scholarly research. When Raoul Hilberg decided to write his doctoral dissertation at Columbia University in New York City in the early 1950s, it would become the founding classic in Holocaust studies entitled "The Destruction of the European Jews." His academic advisor, Franz Neumann, like Hilberg, an exiled Austrian Jew and an early student of Nazi totalitarianism, warned him that with such a topic for a PhD thesis, he stood little chance of getting a university appointment. Against considerable skepticism of fellow academics, Hannah Arendt, for instance, in a rare lapse of judgment, advised Princeton University Press to turn it down. Hilberg's book finally came out in 1961 at a small publisher, Quadrangle Books, thanks to a subsidy from a private benefactor. Hilberg will keep returning to this book for the rest of his life, publishing several updated editions as the years went by and our knowledge of the Holocaust expanded. This is and will remain his major opus. Let me also indicate at the outset that it was not the unavailability of data that made the scholarly community reluctant to engage with the subject of the Shoah in the aftermath of the Second World War. Remarkably, Jewish inhabitants of East European ghettos had launched several initiatives to document how they were being murdered, even while the killings were still going on. The best known of such endeavors was the so-called Oneg Shabbat compilation of evidence on the mass murder of the Jews carried out in the Warsaw Ghetto. In a systematic effort, Documents were assembled, witnesses were interviewed, and their testimonies transcribed. Social surveys on specific topics were conducted by a team of dedicated individuals under the leadership of a historian and social activist, Emanuel Ringelblum. Ringelblum himself did not survive the war. He had been captured and killed in March of 1944. But miraculously, most of the carefully hidden collection of documents was recovered from the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto after the war and is now preserved in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw under the name of the Ringelblum Archive. Furthermore, the Oleg Shabbat Archive, or the Ringelblum Archive, as it is currently known, in honor of its principal organizer, may have been the most complex and comprehensive compilation of documents put together by Jews as the Holocaust was unfolding, but by no means the only one. We know of several other collective enterprises of this sort, carried out in the Kovno Ghetto, for example, or in the Ghetto of Łódź. As if there were a pervasive awareness among the Jews, for such efforts were uncoordinated, that they need to preserve a documentation of contemporaneous events because they are unique, extraordinarily significant in the overall history of the Jews, and because the German perpetrators will try to destroy evidence of their murderous efforts to wipe out the Jewish civilization and Jewish lives in Eastern Europe. There is an apocryphal story from the ghetto in Riga, the capital of Latvia, about the great Jewish historian Simon Dubno. Allegedly, as he was being pushed with other Jews onto a deportation train, which would take him to an extermination camp, he kept shouting, admonishing all who could hear him. Write it all down. Apocryphal stories, whether authentic or not, are meant to capture and illustrate the spirit of the times. Numerous Jews all over occupied Europe had been writing it all down, as it were. Undoubtedly, most of you are familiar, as it is in assigned reading in schools all over the world, with the Diary of Anne Frank. Many such personal documents, diaries and journals with far more dramatic content were left by Jews in occupied Poland. And then, in the immediate aftermath of the war, beginning in the earliest moments after the remnants of European Jewry emerged from hideouts and concentration camps, again, a documentation effort was launched. As Holocaust survivors were prompted by a nucleus of Jewish historians, social workers, and activists to record and collect their testimony. Whether in Poland or in the displaced persons refugee camps, primarily in the occupied American zone of occupied Germany, where tens of thousands of Jewish survivors fled from the post-war upsurge of anti-Semitism in their own countries. We'll talk about it later when Professor Tokarska-Bakir has her presentation, which is incidentally a very important subject in its own right. How was it possible to be an anti-Semite in Europe immediately after the war, in the aftermath of the unprecedented mass murder of European Jews? In those so-called DP camps, displaced persons camps, Jewish organizations, while dispensing aid, were also compiling documentation of the genocide that had just wiped out the lives of 6 million European Jews. In Poland alone, where the destruction of Jewish organized life was particularly thorough, the Central Jewish Historical Commission, active since the end of 1944, under the auspices of the umbrella welfare organization called the Central Committee of Jews in Poland, assembled over 7,000 testimonies. Today, they are housed in the archives of the already mentioned Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. This is where I read Shmuel Wasserstein's testimony, the starting point for reconstructing, in my book entitled Neighbors, the mass murder of Jews in Jedwabne. But there were even more successful efforts to assemble and publish evidence about the Shoah immediately after the war. scores of Jewish journalists who had emigrated to the Americas from Eastern Europe before the war rushed back as soon as Hitler had been defeated in order to find out and report what had happened. They had an eager and desperate audience, the readers of Yiddish language press on all the continents, who pined for any scrap of information about their communities of origin and the fate of relatives. A flood of brilliant reporting about the Shoah followed, with New York's daily forwards. At one time, this was a newspaper with a circulation of 250,000, being the leading venue for such writing. I do not know Yiddish, so I'm not speaking from my own experience, but reading a recent Polish language edition of a collection of Mordechai Zanin's post-war articles from forwards, I discovered what a comprehensive body of knowledge about the Holocaust was available in the public domain at the time. As a result of all these efforts, continuing until the present day, just think of the Visual History Archive initiated by Steven Spielberg after his great movie, the docudrama Schindler's List. The Holocaust is undoubtedly the best documented genocide. And yet, despite all the available evidence about the mass murder of European Jews, decades passed before historians took on the subject. Why was it so? You may legitimately ask. The reasons, as with all important phenomena, were complex, and I suggested some already in this lecture. But I want to mention one more, which is particularly significant for this presentation today. Namely, a deep skepticism among scholars, indeed a rejection that persisted for a long time on methodological grounds of personal testimonies as a reliable source for historical research. Raoul Hilberg, whom I have already acclaimed as a fundamental, indeed foundational contributor to Holocaust research, was an early advocate of this skeptical position. People's recollections are by definition subjective, he would argue, and hence open to criticism as unreliable. But they are not even needed to show the immensity of the Nazi criminal project, which can be demonstrated on the basis of objective, institutionally generated documentation. He proceeded in this fashion, wrote a foundational book in the field, and a paradigm was established. Once academic research on the destruction of European Jewry was set in motion, the terms Holocaust and Shoah would emerge much later, the subject was framed in Hilbergian terms as a confrontation between Jews and Germans. This, of course, captured the gist of what has happened as a result of German Nazi genocidal policies launched against the Jews in occupied Europe. But in time, such a conceptualization began to show its limitations. To be sure, the German organized mechanism and apparatus of destruction was the kernel of the mass killing process. But it was also becoming clear to scholars that the local context mattered. Jews lived for centuries enmeshed in European society, and they had to be extricated therefrom in order to be put to or sent to death. Clearly, to conceptualize the intricacy of the process, a third term encompassing the role of other actors in addition to Jews and Germans was needed to move the discussion forward. Interestingly, it was once again Hilberg who came up with a felicitous suggestion. In 1992, he published a volume entitled Perpetrators, Victims, Bystanders, The Jewish Catastrophe, 1933-1945. And while the book's content did not generate overwhelming interest, its title, indeed one word from the title, made a phenomenal career. Bystanders became a staple of Holocaust historiography's vocabulary, filling the need for the third term, as it were. For the record, it needs to be noted that Hilberg's apparent understanding of what were the bystanders was really bizarre. Suffice it to mention some of the chapter titles included in the section on bystanders in his book: helpers, gainers, the Jewish rescuers, the allies, and also the churches or neutral countries. Quite a mishmash, and a few counterintuitive choices. One wouldn't think of what the helpers or gainers or rescuers were doing necessarily as emblematic of standing by. In any case, the term itself, bystanders, functions in historical parlance about the Holocaust until today. But with time, scholars began to question the concept. What would it mean to be a bystander when confronted with the radical violence to which the Jews during the Holocaust were subjected, especially in Eastern Europe? Is standing by a fitting characterization of what local people and institutions were mostly doing? Enough had been written about the contribution of the Vichy administration in France to the roundups and deportations of Jews, or the role of Hungarian gendarmerie in the summer 1944 mass deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, or about the killings of Jews carried out by auxiliary police formations staffed by locals in the East, to induce a critical evaluation of the concept. Today, in tune with the earlier quoted passage from Friedlander and new monographs compiling supporting evidence, scholars would be inclined to recognize terms such as implicated subjects, for example, facilitators and or beneficiaries, as a more precise characterization of the contribution to the destruction of European Jews by the surrounding population. More precise, that is, than what's conveyed by the term bystander. Now, and this is a methodological observation which I would like to make. The key in sharpening the awareness about the problematic role of local circumstances and the need to account for behavior of the local population in order to understand the mechanics of the Holocaust was a change in evaluation of personal testimonies as a source for historical knowledge. A change from deep skepticism to appreciation of the contribution which they make to our understanding of what had happened. For me, the path to relying on personal testimonies when writing the history of occupation in Eastern Europe during the Second World War opened fairly early. To start, I was trained as a historical sociologist, and the use of questionnaires, including open-ended survey data, as well as personal accounts, is a staple of the profession. But also, I was moved by an accidental discovery in the archives of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. They found there a trove of handwritten statements describing people's experiences under the Soviet occupation of the eastern half of Poland between 1939 and 1941. Jedwabne was situated, among other places. In the 1980s, together with my wife, I published 2 volumes of those documents. The English language volume was called War Through Children's Eyes, as we focused on children's school compositions that were preserved in the archival collection. And then I wrote a book-length monograph about the way Soviet power was introduced in the conquered territories, book that Piotr so generously mentioned, Revolution from Abroad, the Soviet conquest of Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, 1939-1941. I mentioned this because it turned out to be extremely important in the context of Neighbors, which I will publish 12 years later, that I knew all the documentation about the circumstances of Soviet rule in the area. Between September of 1939 and June of 1941, Jedwabne was under the Soviet occupation. Thus, the July 10th murder took place immediately after the German army conquered this territory from the Soviets. And the early criticism of neighbors by unfriendly readers who wanted to dismiss the book without really discussing its content, that is, without confronting what has happened in Jedwabne, their criticism was that I did not understand that the context of the murder on July 10th, 1941, was the prior Soviet rule in the area and the alleged collaboration of local Jews with the Soviet occupiers. Having studied the matter for a decade, and after publishing 3 books about the Soviet rule in Eastern Poland, I couldn't be fooled. In any case, since the release of Claude Lanzmann's documentary film Shoah in 1985, no one could doubt the significance of personal testimonies for understanding of the Holocaust. An epistemological argument in favor of this position could be put simply thus. During periods of social upheaval and disorganization, when institutions collapse and people's interactions are mostly unmediated by bureaucratic routines, when life of the community overflows regular channels, so to speak, and is no longer captured by institutional reporting, the best way, probably the only way, to record and understand what is taking place is through examination of personal testimony. Wars and revolutions belong to this genre of phenomenon. A casualty report after a riot may give an objective count of the number of corpses felt in the streets, but it will say precious little about what actually happened. Instead, subjective personal testimonies offer an empirical foundation for making sense of what goes on in such circumstances. The Holocaust belongs to such a category of violent, unstructured, and fluid social phenomena, which can best be understood on the basis of evidence produced by a myriad of individual experiences put together. So in hindsight, it seems to me that Neighbor's contribution was both methodological, by providing a powerful valuation of personal testimonies for the study of the Holocaust, and substantive, by providing a composite description of an extremely violent episode of local people's complicity in the extermination of the Jews. This was a story of just one little town, but historians had already known for a long time about the wave of internecine violence that decimated Jewish communities in a swath of territory conquered by the German army on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941. Readers understood the Jedwabne massacre as a pars pro toto. A composite image evoked in Neighbors by multiple voices of witnesses and participants gave concrete and memorable shape to the violence, which could be seen as a compilation of well-delineated actions by specific, often named individuals, rather than chaos. The immediately launched investigation of this mass murder by the Institute of National Memory, IPN, in Poland, promptly identified some 20 other townships in the immediate vicinity where local non-Jewish Poles killed their Jewish neighbors, on occasion, even before the German troops had appeared there at all. Neighbors had originally been published in May 2000 in the Polish language edition by a small printing house, Pogrom's, Borderlands. I appreciated the sensitivity of the subject and had not been sure whether a mainstream publisher would be ready to take the book. My worries originated from a warning of sorts which I received a few years before I even knew about the murder in Jedwabne or understood what has happened. In 1997, I published a small volume entitled A Horrible Decade, comprising 3 essays on Polish-Jewish relations during the war. None of the essays spoke about mass murder of Polish Jews by their non-Jewish neighbors. I didn't know at the time that such things as had happened in Jedwabne were possible. I merely noted that anti-Semitism was widespread during the war in all strata of Polish society. There is plenty of documentary evidence from the period to prove this, and I quoted the relevant source. This was the reason why Jews were left without significant help from the rest of the Polish society when Germans proceeded to implement the Holocaust, I argued. It was not the fear of German retaliation for helping the Jews. Poles were notorious for flaunting German prohibitions during the occupation and established the most robust, clandestine, anti-Nazi underground state, państwo podziemne, in all of occupied Europe. So it was not the fear of German retaliation, but rather the lack of a social norm that Jews ought to be helped that determined the Poles' behavior, I conclude. The director of the publishing house, which put out the horrible decade, shortly after the book appeared, told me that for the first time in his professional career, he was confronted with a protest of workers from the printing shop who refused to work on the book because they objected to its content. He prevailed, but this made me worried that I would not be able to publish Neighbors in Polish. And I firmly believe that the book should come out first in Poland so that people, academics, whoever, I did not know what the audience for the book will be, so that people have a chance to discuss it before the book comes out in English. I thought that the story about this mass murder should not come to Poland, as it were, from the outset. And it turned out that my intuition was correct. Henryk Woźniakowski, the editor of a great publishing house from Krakow called Znak, a sort of random house of Poland, where several years later, in 2008 and 2011, I published 2 more books on the subject of Polish-Jewish relations, recalls in his memoirs a conversation we had when I was working on the Jedwabne. He took our conversation, he says, as a sounding out by me whether Znak would be interested in the manuscript. At the time, he writes, he dropped the subject. I decided, this is Woźniakowski speaking, that we were not ready for this, unquote. Frankly, I don't remember such a conversation between us. I don't think I would have presumed that Znak might be interested in the publication at the time. In any case, when I had completed the writing of Neighbors, and all these doubts and worries were going through my head, I also wanted to place the manuscript in trusted hands. I sent it to a friend who had, as I said already, a very small boutique publishing house. Krzysztof Czyżewski, the founder of the Borderlands Foundation, immediately recognized the book's significance and published it forthwith. Neighbors did not initially have a wide distribution. To be honest, it never had a wide distribution in a book format in Poland. In part, I suppose, because Krzysztof, while interested in publishing good books, does not necessarily pay attention whether they get sold. We didn't even sign a contract. I never earned a penny from the sales of the Polish language edition, and I do not know how many copies were sold. But when discussion about Neighbors took off, I asked Czyżewski to place an electronic version of the book on the Borderlands website so that interested people could download it for free. And he did it. These were only the beginnings of the internet, or rather of the wide use of the internet. But I soon found out that students avail themselves of this opportunity. I had a number of meetings in Poland at various university campuses, And young people would come up to me with printouts of the book, asking for an autograph. It took a good 6 months before the main daily newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, published an article about labels. After that, it seemed as if floodgates had opened, and a long, wide-ranging public discussion began. Perhaps the most complex confrontation with collective memory and the need to revise it that the Poles had ever faced. Radio and television programs, newspapers, articles and interviews, essays in professional journals produced between roughly November 2000, when public discussion took off, and July 2001, when the 60th anniversary ceremonies to commemorate the mass murder were organized by the state in Jedwabne. The president of Poland spoke there, among others. So these media productions numbered in the thousands. Because the book's distribution was so inadequate, I worried that in this wide-ranging public discussion, people will mostly learn about the book's content from the voices of polemicists, whether pro or con, which are necessarily partial and not capable or even interested to lay out the story in all its complexity. I decided that I need to make it relatively easy for the general audience, which was bombarded by the word Jedwabne from all the media, to find out on their own what I had actually written in papers about the events of July 10th, 1941. And so I compressed the book to about half of its original size. The book is very small to begin with. And I got the second largest as to circulation daily in Poland, called Rzeczpospolita, the Republic, to publish an insert in its weekend edition with thus abbreviated text of labels. In this way, I felt for very little money, a lot of people could get a firm grasp of the book's content. It was very important for the public discussion of the Jedwabne mass murder that the Polish state decided immediately to launch an official investigation of the matter. A newly created entity called the Institute of National Memory, IPN, which got custody of all the legal documentation concerning German crimes against the Polish nation, as well as the files of communist-era secret police, took charge of it. The investigation of the Jedwabne murder, both in order to establish the historical record and to prosecute people guilty of the crime, if legally viable charges could be brought against them, was the first case that the IPN handled. On July 9th, 2002, the Institute of National Memory issued what amounted to a final communiqué, not yet its final report, just the communiqué, concerning its 20-month-long investigation of the Jedwabne murder. This, in addition to 2 large-size volumes, 1,500 pages in all, that's really large, of relevant documents and studies that they published called Wokół Jedwabnego, concerning Jedwabne. The findings, reported the New York Times on the following day, and I'm quoting from this article in the New York Times, the findings which have been eagerly awaited in Poland were a vindication for Mr. Gross. Key elements of the book's narrative have been therein confirmed. So I'm summarizing with this New York Times article. The murder of Jedwabne Jews was planned in advance by local inhabitants, and many flocked into Jedwabne in the early morning hours of July 10th from outlying villages to take part in it. Direct involvement of the few Germans present on the scene was limited to assisting in the early phase of the crime, when Jews were assembled on the market square. Individual killings were taking place all along before the victims were walked to the barn and set on fire. All but a few dozen Jews present in Jedwabne on the day, including scores who sought refuge there from other towns, were killed. Quote, executors of the crime, and this is a direct quote from the report, IPN report, in the strict sense of the word, were Polish inhabitants of Jedwabne and vicinity, unquote. Property of murdered Jews was plundered after the killing. The IPN worked under heavy pressure to prove the story of the Jedwabne murder wrong, or to fuzz the issue. But the impeccable integrity and commitment to public service of two officials, the prosecutor directly in charge of the investigation, Radosław Ignatiew, and the then head of the Institute of National Memory, Professor Leon Kieres, prevailed in the end. For his determination and fairness throughout the whole process, Kieres and his family received hate mail and anonymous calls. The worst letters are kept away from me, was the title of a long interview he gave about this for Gazeta Wyborcza magazine on July 5th, 2001. And he was verbally abused in the parliament by right-wing deputies, one of them calling on Kieres to resign so that a real Pole could be appointed in his stead. One element, however, of the otherwise scrupulous and professional handling of the investigation by the Institute of National Memory was incompetent. The exhumation of the mass grave in Jedwabne, which should have taken many months to be carried out properly, was completed in 5 days in June 2000. Forensic experts removed only the topsoil covering the mass grave and then tried to probe for the grave's depth and boundaries. Also, the procedure was cut short in deference to the demands of religious Jews in Poland and Israel, who were against disturbing the remains of the dead. But at least it allowed the IPN to identify remains of babies, small children, women, and elderly among the victims, and thus put an end to claims of right-wing apologists who implied that Jewish collaborators of Soviet secret police had been murdered in a revenge killing of the dead. Unfortunately, it was also the source of a hastily produced estimate of 300 to 400 victims allegedly being buried in the mass grave. In the final report, Ignatiew will write at least 340 people were killed. Needless to say, the character as well as the moral and historical implications of the Jedwabne mass murder remain exactly the same, no matter whether 300 people or 1,600 people were killed. Yet because the IPN investigation established that all but a few dozen Jedwabne Jews had been murdered on that day, in order for the smaller number to make sense, one would have to account for some 1,000 additional Jews from Jedwabne and vicinity, who, we know this from census figures and testimonies of witnesses of the day's events, who were in town on July 10th. In any event, IPN investigators evidently felt bound to accept the figures produced as a result of the incomplete forensic expertise they commissioned. Ironically, this is a point taken up now entirely in bad faith by extreme right-wing xenophobes who argue that the IPN investigation is inconclusive, indeed wrong in its conclusions, and that Poles would be exonerated had the exhumation not been interrupted in deference to Jewish religious law. For the record, I want also to make clear that I protested in writing. Gazeta Wyborcza published my intervention against not carrying out the exhumation properly, even if it took a long time to do this job in conformity with professional standards. The 60th anniversary of the crime was approaching, and the state authorities wanted the site cleared and a new monument to the dead erected in time to organize an official commemoration of the victims. I was told later by two important rabbis that given the circumstances in which the Jedwabne Jews had been murdered and buried, it was okay to remove the remains, and that those who objected to it simply did not know the Jewish law. 20 years after the publication of the book, two divergent responses to the Jedwabne murders stand out. On one hand, there has been in Poland a truly extraordinary proliferation of scholarship and artistic production about all aspects of Polish-Jewish relationships during the Second World War. A profound reckoning with the legacy of this difficult past. Especially significant was the establishment in 2003 of the Center for Holocaust Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Professor Grabowski is one of the founders. The yearbook of the center, called Zagłada Żydów, Studia i Materiały, Holocaust of the Jews, Studies and Documentation, 18 thick volumes by now, is by itself tantamount to a whole library covering the subject in minute details from a variety of perspectives. But in addition, many scholars unaffiliated with the center, publishing in periodicals from all the disciplines in humanities, are also key contributors to this amazingly rich new field of research. A good sampling in English of the current writings on the Holocaust in Poland, reflecting a variety of interests and approaches, can be found in a recently published volume entitled Breaking the Frame. Neighbors has given a push to the proliferation of this literature. But there was something in the air already, and it surfaced unexpectedly all over history. When communism fell in the region, in the so-called miraculous year, Annus Mirabilis, 1918, and then the Soviet Union dissolved, local societies regained sovereignty and proceeded to freely organize their politics. They also, presumably, these societies regained their past. Subjugated for decades under Communist Party censorship, peoples were now free to study previously inaccessible state archives, files of the secret police, and Communist Party documents in their respective countries. And when they did, it turned out that there were no real skeletons hidden in the closets as far as the period of the communist rule was concerned. No big secrets unearthed, no as yet unaired misdeeds of the communists brought to the surface, nothing that would shed a radically new light on significant episodes of contemporary history. At most, the opening of secret police archives led to a slew of personal reputations destroyed when it was revealed that a public figure had not owned up to the fact that he or she at some point in the past was a secret police collaborator. Simultaneously, however, it began to surface all over Eastern Europe that the difficult past, one that had not been worked through or even narrated in accordance with the facts, was the Second World War and the German occupation of the region. One aspect in particular was blowing up the accepted cliches, which rooted the sense of collective identity of the local people in a narrative about the suffering and persecution experienced at the hands of the communists and all the fascists. Namely, the untold story of complicity of the local population in the extermination of the Jews. This has been, it turned out, the real skeleton rattling in the closets of 20th century East European societies. A deeply fraught subject. So, not surprisingly, in response to neighbors, in addition to proliferation of this new historiography about Polish-Jewish relations during the war, there was also a complete opposite reaction, a backlash, one brilliant Polish scholar called, emanating from the so-called patriotic, indeed nationalistic segments of the Polish society. The backlash fed into stereotypes and prejudices of a large public entrenched in a traditional worldview promulgated by the Catholic Church. Since 2015, following the electoral victory of the nationalistic and xenophobic Law and Justice Party, PIS, the pushback with respect to the Jedwabne massacre dominates government-controlled public life. One of the policies of the Law and Justice Party is especially relevant here. It's so-called politics of history, politica historyczna, based on the premise that any government has a right to advocate a vision of its country's history that it likes. The polityka historyczna promoted by the current regime in Poland aims, as per official PIS slogans, to raise Poland from its knees. No more pedagogy of shame. PIS politicians and affiliated intellectuals proclaim in response to the wide-ranging discussion about Poles' co-responsibility for the persecution of their Jewish fellow citizens during the war. Westerplatte, the site of heroic resistance against German assault at the beginning of the war, or Jedwabne, a prominent historian, rhetorically framed the alternative with an article published by a large circulation daily. A national community cannot be constituted on the basis of shame. Strangely, in his polemical fervor, he didn't bother to explain why a national community could not be constituted on the basis of historical truth. What could perhaps evolve into an interesting discussion among educated professionals when instrumentalized by politicians turned into crass mendacity. For the past several years, the PIS regime, through designated institutions, has advocated a false narrative that Polish society during the German occupation, for the most part, tried to save its Jewish fellow citizens. This is in contradiction to historical evidence, and the continuing work of the new Polish School of Holocaust Scholarship, internationally recognized for its professional excellence, provides mounting evidence to the contrary. An international conference honoring the achievements of Polish scholars, organized by a leading university in Paris in February 2019, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, provided a shocking spectacle to French academics when a posse of PIS regime sympathizers staged their vocal anti-Semitic protest. Several articles have been written about this episode in France. The event's notoriety prompted the drafting of an informative Wikipedia entry, the entry New Polish School of Holocaust Scholarship / Conference, which contains also a good bibliography. I may add also that an earlier conference held prior to the coming to power of the PIS regime in Poland, which took place at Princeton University in October of 2010, where scholars from the Polish Center of Holocaust Research discussed their findings with American colleagues, also triggered an unprofessional response, this time from a high official in the Polish government, the Consul General of Poland in New York, which shocked American scholars. An American was present there, Professor Ben Frommer, wrote an article about it in East European Politics and Society. It's quite a read. The current Polish regime has tried to gag further research in the field through legislation, intimidation, and propaganda. The legislative attempt, which created an uproar of international protests, particularly from Israel and the United States, was a January 2018 law that stated, penalized essentially writing about contribution of Poles in the persecution of Jews. It was widely recognized as an attempt to discourage research on Polish complicity in the persecution of Jews during the German occupation. It also criminalized personal experiences of all those Jews who had ever been extorted, blackmailed, or denounced by the Poles, as most survivors had been at some point. Now, if they spoke about it, they would be violating Polish law. It's created a furor in Israel, as you can imagine. This is not meant to say that there weren't any Poles who tried to save their fellow Jewish citizens during the war. The Yad Vashem in Jerusalem recognized over 7,000 Poles as righteous among the nation. So there were Polish neighbors who had helped the Jews, and many lost their lives while doing so, primarily because they were treated as pariah in their own society. They were spied upon and denounced to the Germans by their own neighbors. Long after the war had ended, they were afraid to admit to their noble deeds, fearing ostracism and even violence from their own community. Irena Sendla, a courageous rescuer who saved many Jewish children, put it thus, quote, "It is certain that it was much easier to find a place in the living room in occupied Warsaw or a large canon would be hidden under the carpet than to find a place for one little Jewish child. One way or another, Poland cannot come to terms with the mass murder of Polish Jews which took place during the Second World War. Because of extreme violence and the sheer number of people involved, it should have been recognized as a central element of Poland's wartime experience. And yet, for most Poles, the Holocaust is an episode which had affected somebody else. What I want to say is that in the perception of the general public, or if one were to use a long-established sociological concept, in the collective memory of the people, Holocaust is not conceived as a component part of mainstream Polish history. It is instead understood as something that has happened to them and not to us. But if 1/3 of the urban population of a country is suddenly removed, exiled from the social fabric, as it were, I'm talking about 3 million Polish Jews, 1/3 of Poland's urban population killed during the Holocaust. Then the rest of so affected society is set in motion. Any social scientist would tell you this without hesitation, in a massive process of social transformation and social mobility. From the perspective of a social historian, it seems to me, such an externalization of the Holocaust in Poland, in other words, espousing the conviction that has happened to them and not to us, requires as an underpinning a very peculiar mental framing of historical phenomena. It would be as if the French people espoused the belief, because victims of the Great Terror came predominantly from the aristocracy, that the French Revolution was an episode in just the history of the French nobility. After 3 decades of research and writing about Poland's wartime history, the story of the Jedwabne mass murder caught me totally unprepared. To write Neighbors, I needed to lift my own incredulity at what the evidence revealed. It took time, and it came in stages. And this personal experience of only gradually coming to grips with what had happened gave me an understanding for the reluctance of the reading public in Poland to absorb the story. The manner in which mass murder in Jedwabne was carried out went against the grain of the national myth of victimization, the master narrative about the war, so central to Polish identity and rooted in the experience of so many Polish families. In time, people will be confronted with evidence that the Jedwabne episode was only one among many acts of brutality against Jewish Poles carried out by non-Jewish Poles. But Jewish testimonies documenting these facts have been for a long time ignored. And I was troubled by my own ignorance of this duality, that people may be victims and act as victimizers at the same time, despite so many years of reading, research, and family conversations about the experience of war and occupation. I'm finishing, Piotr, so we'll be able to intervene in 1 second. The publication of Neighbors was a teachable moment. Disaster.
Somebody doesn't like what you're saying.
The publication, what was it? It's interesting. It's not a janitor. Yeah, I thought so. The publication of Neighbors was a teachable moment about the ugliest face of Polish anti-Semitism. The publication of Neighbors was a teachable moment about the ugliest face of Polish anti-Semitism, just as the murder of George Floyd was a teachable moment about institutionalized racist violence in America. A few years ago, I would have thought that the official backlash would not really matter in the face of accumulating historiography of the Shoah, which steadily compounds evidence of local people's complicity in the persecution of their Jewish fellow citizens. I was convinced, as I wrote in the afterword to the 2002 edition of Neighbors, that the next generation of Poles would learn the facts and soberly reflect on them and absorb their significance. But I am no longer so unequivocally optimistic. The ascendancy of Trumpism in America and the way it lingers after the 2020 presidential election, in defiance of common sense, put everyone on notice that facts and sober reflection may not easily prevail in the public mind. It revealed also that racism, xenophobia, and mendacity in public life are not an exclusive prerogative of some faraway country. En Pologne, c'est-à-dire nulle part. In Poland, there is nowhere. Alfred Jarry famously quipped in the Didaskalia to this surrealist play, Himel, except that Poland is not known, and neither is the United States. And even though mendacity flowing from the seats of government will not change history, I am afraid it will make writing history and learning about the past more of a challenge. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to our second presentation today. And we are about to listen to Professor Jan Grabowski from the University of Ottawa. He's a full professor there and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. He graduated from the University of Warsaw in 1986. Then he emigrated to Canada. In 1993, he joined the faculty of the University of Ottawa, and approximately at the same time, he received his PhD from the Université de Montréal. He has a lot of achievements, but in 2003, he was one of the co-founders of the Polish Center for Holocaust Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. And this was a major breakthrough because before this, there was no scholarly unit in Poland dealing with the Holocaust, which bordered on a scandal, as a matter of fact, that the situation was like this. So the establishment of the center was a major establishment. And he also co-organized, in my opinion, the best journal on the Holocaust in Poland, the best worldwide journal on the Holocaust in Poland, and this is Zagłada Żydów, Shoah of the Jews, 18 volumes, as Professor Gross said, and there is nothing which could compete with this title. This is my opinion. But returning to Professor Grabowski, in 2011, in a Polish version, and in 2013, in an English version, he published, I would say, his breakthrough or turning point, or very important book, Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-occupied Poland. And this started a series of books. Too many to talk about all of them. And then the most outstanding achievement, and I congratulated him on this many times because this is, in my opinion, a monumental achievement, namely Night Without End, The Fates of Jews in Selected Counties of Occupied Poland, co-edited with Barbara Engelking. You probably know about the book. The volumes now, an English edition appeared, and this is really something great. The last thing published so far by Professor Grabowski is, let me give you an English title, On Duty, the Role of the Polish Blue and Criminal Police in the Holocaust. And the book appeared in 2020. I guess this is the last one, I believe. I don't know. I'm very proud here as well, because imagine once Professor Grabowski was my student, and 100 years ago in a different life, and one of the authors of Night Without End, a person who authored one of the chapters, is my former PhD student. And I'm proud of this too, because this is basically what he did with me. Professor Grabowski, please go ahead. I'm afraid we have to deal with this very much. Should I talk to the microphone here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Works.
that should work. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I thank you, Professor Rubel, for this very kind introduction. Indeed, I am your student in a way, and I fondly remember the 1984-85 seminar at University of Warsaw, where I produced a piece of investigative historical analysis, which you rewarded me with 4 minus, which is about, which is equivalent of
This was not necessary.
75%, but I treasure this memory. In any case, let me start my thank you for this invitation. Thank you very much for getting us all here. I do have a presentation which is in a way connected to Jan Grabowski's presentation. In so many ways that you will find certain patterns, paths, and trails overlapping 15 to 20 years later. So while Professor Gross discussed the beginnings of the 20th century and the crucial discussions and debate, I will sort of invite you to look at the more current situation, which is not which is very complex, so to say. Now, as an avid coin collector, I like to bring to my lectures coins whenever possible. And 2 of these coins you have in front of you right now. One of them I already displayed in 2015 at a conference in Princeton organized by Sir Gross. But then it was more for laughs. Today it's much more serious. And what you see are 2 commemorative coins produced by the Polish mint in 2009, mind you, years before the ultra-nationalists came to power, still under the democratic regime. Basically, these 2 coins encapsulate what I have to say. So they are sort of a leap to conclusion. But I would like you to seize the idea of Holocaust distortion, which is at the core of my speech for today. What you see on the coin on the left, you have a 2 zloty coin with a title, Poles Saving Jews. And now this coin commemorates Polish virtue, Polish bravery in the face of Nazi repression. It is also a very stern and typical example of Holocaust distortion. In other words, Holocaust people, institutions who engage in distorting or falsifying the history of the Shoah, they don't deny the factuality of what has happened. What they simply do, they shift accents and they obfuscate the historical record. In this case, you see here to an ethnic Polish woman with a child on her hands. It is a woman who has been executed by the Germans for having saved the Jews. Now, the Jews are not really relevant to this kind of story. The Jews muddle the story. For people who are operating in the distortion of the Holocaust area, the Jews should be removed from the history of the Holocaust, which sounds bizarre, but believe me, it is possible, and it's being constantly attempted. So if you can see the stereotypical tiny figure under the Polish baby, so to say, stereotypical figure of a Jew, you will see this disappearing figure which represents the place of the Jews in Polish official narrative. Now, if you look at the larger coin on the right, a very nice coin, you can see the wall broken down or being broken down with the Star of David. So even those who don't know what ghetto walls in Warsaw looked like have a fairly good idea, because the Star of David is stamped on the front of it, and you have the barbed wire torn away by Polish eagle floating over the wall. Now, of course, Polish eagle represents the Polish state. Well, unfortunately, as most of us know, Polish state did preciously little, whether in, let's say, its foreign representation or its institutions of the Polish state, underground Polish state in Poland. So this is another way to represent, let's say, the Holocaust, the distortion of the Holocaust, and I will expand on it in a moment. By and large, you don't deny the Holocaust, simply you say our people had nothing to do with the event, or quite to the contrary, we did everything humanly possible in order to assist our brothers, Jewish brothers and sisters at the period of need. And here we come to 2018. Professor Gross began his lecture with the Latin proverb, habent sua fata libelli, or that books had their destinies. And indeed, book Neighbors had its destiny, and so did the book that I am very actually happy to show here today, which is Night Without End, English edition, which has been published just a couple of weeks ago by Indiana University Press. But this book in its Polish form, an original form, 2 volumes, has been published in Poland in the spring of 2018, which was perhaps the most dangerous time to produce a critical assessment of Polish Jewish history in recent years. It overlapped with the so-called Polish Holocaust law, mentioned also by Professor Gross before. And this book triggered, I would say, an unprecedented and vicious attack by the institutions of the Polish state. I'm not even referring here to people who, let's say, joined the bandwagon. But in terms of official resources committed to fighting critical research, I don't think ever in Polish history historiography we had anything like it. It is a dubious distinction, but one that I would like to stress here. And part of this struggle reached the courts. I'm not going to talk much about the courts here. I will mention them. These things, for the most part, are well known. But on February 9, 2021, so a year and a half ago, Judge Ewa Jończyk of the Warsaw District Court rendered her judgment in the civil lawsuit filed by Filomena Leszczyńska against Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski. The plaintiff claimed that the defendants, both historians of the Shoah, in a recently published specialized and academic book, which I just had a pleasure of showing you, slandered the memory of her long deceased uncle, wrongly accusing him of having betrayed under the occupation hidden Jews to the Germans. On the surface, the case looked like one more of the many civil lawsuits filed by a party wishing to defend the good name of the family. In reality, the case was prepared, orchestrated, and financed by a far right-wing nationalistic organization serving as a proxy for the Polish state. The justification of the verdict covered 37 pages, but few sentences were of particular significance for historians in general and for historians of the Holocaust in particular. I believe I can stop sharing for a moment here. And, right. So these few sentences, I believe, are important enough to be quoted here. So I quote. That's my own translation from Polish. In the light of the above presented ideas and the jurisprudence, we can assume that ascribing to Poles the crimes of the Holocaust committed by the Third Reich can be construed as hurtful and striking at the feeling of identity and national pride. The unprecedented historical events, which constitute the legacy of the community and of its individual members, and which are considered as factual beyond any discussion, cannot be made relative, because it risks to strike against the feeling of national belonging and provokes feeling of harm. This forms among the public opinion a drastically untrue image of Poland and ascribes to Poles characteristics which tear away their dignity and undermine their sense of own value. To blame Poles for the Holocaust, for the killing of Jews during World War II, and for the seizure of their property, touches upon the sphere of national legacy, dziedzictwa narodowego, and consequently is completely untrue and hurtful, can impact one's feeling of an own national dignity, destroying the justified, based on facts, conviction that Poland was the victim of war operations, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, in this short paragraph, Warsaw District Court basically decided that critical writing of history of the Holocaust is no longer possible in Poland. Elevating legally undefined concept such as national dignity to the area of material rights, which require legal protection under the civil code, would spell an end to any critical pursuit in our area. Furthermore, and perhaps even more importantly, if we decide that this national pride can be wounded in a way, and each and every Pole can feel being wronged and therefore can file a lawsuit, you can easily imagine what it means in, let's say, practical area. Now, the thing is that this is just a sign of malaise of things which we have to deal right now. But now let's look at the more general scenery in Poland on this memorial situation. One of these shocking statistics that I would like to bring to your attention is that in a poll conducted 1 year ago, 71% of Polish respondents declared that Poles and Jews suffered equally during the war, or that Poles suffered more. If you have 71% of respondents declaring opinions of the sort, it means that something on memorial scene in terms of national consciousness has happened, a shift of monumental proportions, which speaks volumes about the development of memorial conscience between the publication of Neighbors in year 2000 and today. It is also a testimony to this incredible success of Holocaust distortion, how easily it can conquer hearts and minds of very many people. Now, at this stage, of course, you can ask me, why really we in North America should pay so much attention to Poland? Well, there is a number of reasons or answers which I would like to invoke why Poland should be at the heart of our discussions. One, on the Polish so-called administrative territory, 5 out of 6 million Jews, victims of the Holocaust, found their deaths. There are 3 million Polish Jews, Polish citizens, more than half of all victims of the Holocaust who were Polish citizens. So more than every second victim of the Holocaust was a Polish citizen. All death camps have been located by the Germans on Polish territories. And finally, a number which I would like to give to you, from among the Polish Jews who had the misfortune of finding themselves under the Nazi boot, between 1 and 1.5% survived the war. It is an unprecedented, you can say, in the history of humanity. It is an extermination of unprecedented efficiency. 1 to 1.5% of Jews in Poland who found themselves under the Nazi boot survived the war. So whether Poland wanted or wants or not, Poland has become I would call it a reluctant custodian of the memory of the Holocaust. I would even say a very reluctant custodian of the memory of the Holocaust. Following up on what has been said here earlier, I would add that it is quite frustrating that, and significant also that there is not even one museum of the Holocaust in Poland. Not even one museum of the Holocaust in Poland. And as far as I know, there is not even one chair of Holocaust history on any Polish university. These things are indicated. Now, in my dealings with Polish museums, there were also museums as vehicles of, let's say, construction of knowledge and propagation of knowledge. There is this trend to disassociate Holocaust from Polish history. As Professor Gross mentioned, it is not really seen as a part of Polish history. Just a few weeks ago, I was presented a 900-page long volume called Geschichte Polens, which means Poland's history, 900-page long, co-written by a very good, very well-known Polish historian, Andrzej Friszke, and Professor Dudek. Now, in this 900-page long synthesis of Polish history, destined for German audience, there is 9 pages devoted to the, I would say, greatest catastrophe in Polish history. 9 pages. Which means that even in the eyes of people who are very well respected in their domain, Holocaust remains an insular, distant event that has little to do with Polish history. If you look at the websites of so-called camp museums, you will find something strange. If you look at any other Polish museum, their internet, their website endings are .pl, which means Polish website. There is only one exception from this rule. All websites of extermination camps have a domain name .eu, Europe, or in the case of Auschwitz, .org. Now, it's quite significant to see this constant need to break any association between extermination of Polish Jews and Polish history and Polish society as well. It's quite significant. The dramatic trend to depolonize, let's say, any kind of links. For instance, we are not talking about Łódź ghetto, we are talking about Litzmannstadt ghetto. Now I was told that we are not talking about Płaszów concentration camp, but Plaszow. Sobibór loses its diacritical sign over the last O, so it's not Sobibór, it's German Sobibor. It might sound not very relevant, but I assure you it's very relevant. I recall my conversation with the then Democratic Minister of Culture back in 2013, who was livid. She told me that these extermination camps are like those poisoned presents dropped by the Germans and now haunting Polish countryside. We had nothing to do with it, and the Germans left it behind. Now, the problems with Stolpersteine in today's Poland, probably you, most of you are familiar with those plaques, commemorative plaques, tripping stones, Stolpersteine inserted into sidewalks of many European cities. In Poland, they have been practically made illegal by the notorious Institute of National Remembrance that Jan Gross mentioned, which especially after 2015, has become a militant hub of Holocaust distortion. Now, why these Stolpersteine are made, let's say, not illegal, but unwelcome? Well, too much of Jewish memory is not welcome in any case. Gradual changes in terminology. After the war, it was Nazi. Now it's German Nazi, trending towards German. I would like to return now to the sharing mode. Give me a second here. Okay. What you see in front of you here is from last year. And in Warsaw, you have sandstone markers. They are very well known to all people of Warsaw, dating back to 1949. And on these, they had the habitual inscription here, the Nazis executed so many and so many Poles. Each and every citizen of Warsaw knows by heart these sandstone markers. So last year, they have been covered by very nationalistic groups with the sign Germans. It is also indicative of this trend to redefine the perception of the occupation of war and so on. Let me just close this. What is going on here? First of all, it is a process which scholars of the Holocaust call Holocaust envy. A nation steeped in contemplation of its own suffering, there is little room for recognition, appreciation, and commemoration of other suffering. And now, especially if this appreciation of suffering of the other brings back memories of earlier exploitation, hostility, and pogroms, which are associated with one's own ethnic or national group. Or if the recognition of the suffering of the other threatens to diminish the recognition of your own national suffering. Best example here is the example of Warsaw ghetto uprising of 1943, casting its shadow over the Warsaw uprising of August, September 1944. A constant reminder by Polish right-wing circles, we cannot allow the Warsaw ghetto uprising to overshadow our own suffering. Now, this Holocaust envy translates or exists in a variety of different layers or strata of narrative, historical narrative. One of them very often seen is the question of 6 million dead. In other words, 3 million Jews and 3 million ethnic Poles. Now, this number of 3 million ethnic Poles has been pulled out of hat by one Jakub Berman in 1945 in order to make Polish society accept the Jewish losses. He said, we need to elevate the Polish ethnic losses at least to the same level, which has been done by a directive in 1945, and it still is very much a dominant piece of this Holocaust envy. Things like Polish Holocaust, Little Holocaust are now current parts of not even nationalistic, very much popular, I would say, discourse. I remember 6-7 years ago when I was invited by Jan Grabowski to Princeton at a conference, we had a lively debate about the dangers ahead. I had no idea how imminent these dangers actually were. I was concerned. I did not know how quickly this train actually is approaching. And I remember that at the time in the discussion, someone, I believe it was then director of the Polin Museum, Professor Stola, said, well, I'm not preoccupied, he said, with this nationalistic propaganda. You know, we have been in a communist school, to me, you and I, and it never worked. This communist propaganda never took any root. To which I responded, the problem here is that in order for propaganda to be efficient, you need somehow, at some point, to agree with it. So you cannot force people to swallow products they don't want to swallow. They will refuse. However, if you sell this sweet substance that the nationalists sell about the virtue of own a nation, this product will penetrate and it will poison for perhaps generations the conscience of the nation. And this is exactly what I think has happened. But this question of Holocaust envy, which goes under through this, is a let's say common denominator seen all around. I'm looking at the watch here, but I have some time. So let me know when I have to.
Be sure about it.
Good. So this other dimension of Holocaust envy, you might remember in June of 2018, so fairly recently, Polish authorities under tremendous pressure exerted by the United States and Israel decided to decriminalize the provisions of the Polish Holocaust law. In other words, historians would not go for 3 years to prison, but they would just face civil litigation as I am facing right now. And in a process, Morawiecki, Polish Prime Minister, signed a joint declaration with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, in which both gentlemen and their respective governments recognized that anti-Semitism should be considered at par with anti-Polonism. Now, anti-Polonism does not exist. I mean, it exists in the sick minds of people sick with nationalism. There is a bizarre idea of people who believe in anti-Polonism that there is a world conspiracy that wants to bring down the Polish nation. Now, to put anti-Semitism, an ideology 2,000 years in the making, responsible quite recently for 6 million deaths, and to place it at equal footing with anti-Polonism just demonstrates how desperate Israeli authorities are to secure some kind of foothold in the European Union. So what happens in Poland is growth of this memorial battle led on several fields and conducted with, I would say, brutality and force by the institutions financed by Polish government, such as the Institute of National Remembrance, Pilecki Institute, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and various NGOs richly subsidized by the Polish state. I learned recently that one of these institutions, the name is bizarre, it's called Institute to Combat Anti-Polonism. So this institute, in its wisdom, chose to report me to the prosecutor's office, and my crime consisted of writing in social media that people in Poland should not forget that extermination camps were not for Poles, but they were for Jews. And this was enough to trigger this kind of prosecutorial complaint. Now, here we come to, so we have in Poland a number of laws, so I don't have the time to go over them, but Article 133, which Professor Gross is very familiar with, of slandering the good name of the nation, Article 55, Article 55A, and the civil procedure, all of them are hanging over our collective head, if I can refer to us as a community of scholars involved in critical assessment of recent Polish Jewish past. Now, here we come to the primary line of defense, which is Polish righteousness, mentioned by also Professor Gross. As you see, we are meeting here on so many different levels. So representing Polish righteousness, a courageous small group of courageous people who acted against certain social norm, to present them as a Polish default position, a norm of the Polish society. Now, the 7,000+ righteous recognized by Yad Vashem is way not enough, say Polish authorities. We need, as they say, commemoration of hundreds of thousands, and I quote, even millions of Poles who were saving the Jews. Now, the problem is that Yad Vashem requires corroboration of Polish voice with Jewish voice. In other words, you need to find a Jewish witness to have the title. So in Poland, the authorities and their legions of their supporters in this case made a very strong push for rejection of Jewish testimony and replacing it with enthusiastic endorsement by sometimes very, very late Polish testimonies. So here we come to an additional part of this distortion, which is control of territory and space. As I wrote in several articles over last year, some of you might remember that in November last year, so 10 months ago, one of these institutions created to this, among other things, to distort the Holocaust, namely Pilecki Institute, erected in Treblinka, to be more precise, at the state railway station Treblinka, a monument to a Pole who allegedly delivered out of the goodness of his heart water to Jews waiting in death trains to be pushed into the death camp nearby, and was shot for his trouble by the Germans. There is no credible record to back it up, but the monument stands. The monument stands with an inscription. It's devoted to memory of a Pole with a name and 900,000 Jews. And this monument represents this mutual memorial obligation of sorts. In the immediate vicinity of Treblinka, you have now 10 other monuments to, I call them Polish virtue. It is a real offensive. It is a sort of struggle which has its material representation. It's not only memory, it's now very tangible. It is cast in stone, quite literally. Płaszów concentration camp, a monument unveiled 8 years ago to the memory of Polish blue policemen executed by the Germans at the site. Not by accident, this monument has been located exactly in Płaszów, not in front of any of 124 churches of Kraków. Warsaw Ghetto, sanitary cordon of Polish memory. I just recently, I flew from Warsaw a few days ago, but half a year ago, I was negotiating streets around in a downtown ghetto, as I call it, the last part of Jewish memory in Warsaw. And I found to my amazement that in addition to a path of Irena Sendler, monument of Jan Karski, very courageous people, we now have also a roundabout of Polish righteous, and we have a special tree devoted to Żegota, and so on and so forth. Now, control of commemorations. March 1st, Day of Cursed Soldiers, żołnierze wyklęci. Poles celebrate on March 1st, the Day of Cursed Soldiers. Now, the problem from our point of view is that cursed soldiers, or the partisans or people who continued to fight communists after 1944-45, well, they carried with them a very, very sad legacy of murdering the Jews too, something that Professor Tokarska-Bakir knows much more about than I do. On March 24th, the Poland celebrates National Day of Commemoration of Poles saving Jews during the Holocaust. On June 14, National Day of Commemoration of the victims of German Nazi concentration camps and death camps. Now, I would like to tell you that putting together these things, concentration camps and death camps, is not it's not by chance. It is a part of the same memorial process of Holocaust envy, blending these two things together. And once again, I will share for a second here this screen to show you a few slides. So perhaps does it work? Yeah. If you look at the poster, this is from 2020, so fairly recent history. The poster I would like to bring to your attention is the one in the middle, between Polish President Duda and the Polish Pope. It says Poles were the first prisoners of Auschwitz German death camp. Well, of course, for people who don't know much of history, why not, you say? Well, not. Poles were not first prisoners in Auschwitz German death camp. They were first prisoners in Konzentrationslager Auschwitz, in concentration camp. But these things, this is the way these things go. What is more even insidious is this blending of Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II. So in other words, you represent concentration camp and extermination camp as one. And it's very sad to see, this is actually Museum Auschwitz official Twitter account, social media account of Auschwitz Museum, which during a very heated dispute regarding Poles being victims of extermination policies, joined the crowd and wrote, let me just translate this part. One can assume that more Poles have been killed in Auschwitz II than in Auschwitz I. Birkenau has been the largest part of Auschwitz, and many prisoners selected in Auschwitz I camp hospital were also murdered in gas chambers of Birkenau. The same thing happens in Treblinka, as some of you know, but this is of course not a common knowledge. There was Treblinka I, which was a very cruel and brutal Arbeitserziehungslager, which means work camp, and the Treblinka II, which was a death camp. These two are now being blended into Treblinka. And I just learned, I must tell you today in the morning, that there is a Holocaust Medal of Honor, I quote, issued and given out by Treblinka Museum, and I quote, to honor 800,000 Jews, Poles, and Gypsies killed at this site. So this is the part now of de-Judaization of the Holocaust, blaming the Jews for their own demise, which is, of course, Judenräte, the Jewish councils, and the Jewish police. And here, and I know that my time is slowly running out. But still, it's fine. Good. And here I would like to invoke the words of a notorious statement made by Polish Prime Minister a few years back. There were Jewish perpetrators and there were Polish perpetrators. So this kind of, let's say, equalization here between making relative the blame for the Holocaust is one thing that we find very, very common. Now, let me go back to a few pictures with which I wanted to finish this lecture of mine, or talk of mine. So, and this one will be of much more personal nature. In other words, how this historical policy of the Polish state translates into real events, into real memories. The picture you see here is a picture of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and his sons, including my grandfather. The picture I wanted to bring to your attention was actually this one here. This is the grave. This picture I made in 1984, 1983. This is a picture of mass grave of 500, more than 500 Jews who have been murdered in August of 1942 by the Germans, mostly elderly people, including my great-grandfather and his daughter. As you see also, there is a cross. There is a cross which I found very strange. Why a cross would? It shows to you that these memorial battles predate by decades and decades, of course, the current issues, the current policies of the Polish government. When I went to talk to a local village mayor in a village nearby, he told me that at least one convert must have been between the 500 Jews, and that if I touch the cross, there will be hell to pay. So this is actually, once again, predating by a long time this issues I discussed today with you. Another from this family history, something that Professor Tokarska-Bakir actually sort of made so clear to me. I learned from her actually. And one of my grandfather's brothers, Salem Abrahamr, was murdered in 1946, as I was told by the family story, by bandits. Time when people were killing each other, many victims. However, Professor Tokarska-Bakir went to an archive and unearthed documents which proved that the cursed soldiers, the heroes of Polish narrative of today, have been responsible for that particular murder. So the story is, so to say, unfolding. Just at the end, and to finish, I would like here to, so what you see is a certain immutability or lack of transformation of national consciousness, whether we are talking about 1980, so we move further on, we are facing the same questions and same answers, unfortunately, too. Now, never was I more aware of the concluding of the immutability and resilient persistence of denial than when reading a yellowed carbon copy of a letter written by my father, a Holocaust survivor, in September 1973. The letter was addressed to Kazimierz Koźniewski, a well-known and influential Polish writer, and during the war, a courageous soldier in the Polish armed resistance. Visibly upset with an article published some time before by Koźniewski, my father wrote, let me quote short excerpts, I quote, "Before the war, our society was filled with intolerance and anti-Semitism, which flowed from pages of the press, preached from the pulpits in churches, and eagerly sucked up by younger generations like mother's milk. There were very few people of the pre-war Polish society who consciously opposed this intolerance and its most glaring representation, anti-Semitism. War and occupation were a horrible shock therapy for the whole nation, but even they were unable to make people shake off the accumulated resentments, to leave behind the old mental patterns, and to cure the indifference of bad conscience. Nowadays, nearly everyone, you included," wrote my father in 1973, celebrates national remembrance. Polish society was united and firm against the Germans. Germans were a common enemy. People supported and warned each other. The signs of collaboration, even a moral one, were being eliminated. There was, however, no universal condemnation of the German treatment of the Jews. There was no common attitude of Polish public opinion toward the Jewish tragedy. Entire social strata enriched themselves on wealth of Jews driven into the ghettos and later murdered. When this source of income dried up, they started blackmailing and delivering into the hands of the Germans the remaining few who were hiding on the Aryan side. I was one of them. There was no atmosphere conducive to helping Jews. Those who decided to engage in this noble risk did it on their own. They had to hide against their own people. In the case of a hidden partisan, Polish society was united. Not so in a case of a hidden Jew. You surely remember those so popular and so horrible words. After all, we should build a golden monument to Hitler. He does our dirty work for us. Many of those who knocked in fear found the door slammed in our faces. Oftentimes we were met with mockery and insults. People set dogs on us. There was this characteristic sign, an evil glitter in one's eyes, which for me was a warning: run, this man will betray you. This conspiracy of silence concerns practically everything considered shameful in the eyes of the nation. The hyenas did not die. They have not fled. They live peacefully among us as respected citizens. Now, the problem is, sadly, I could today send this letter to a Polish newspaper, and it could be printed as a voice in an ongoing debate without a value, without a comma being changed. So who controls present, controls the past? Among the scholars of the Holocaust, debates were raging for a long time. What shall happen to the memory of the Holocaust once the generation of survivors passes away? If we are to judge by what is happening in Poland, the future looks dark. Thank you.
So now we are about to hear a lecture by Professor Joanna Tokarska-Bakir. Professor Joanna Tokarska-Bakir is a professor and chair at the Institute of Slavic Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. In fact, at the same time, she is associate member of the General Assembly of the Polish Academy of Sciences. So to put it in Polish, członek PAN, not just a person employed by PAN, but a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Professor Tokarska-Bakir graduated from the University of Warsaw in 1983. In 1993, she got her PhD at the University of Warsaw. In 2010, she became a full professor. In 2007, she was awarded the Jan Karski and Pola Nireński Prize from the EVO. She is a cultural anthropologist, literary scholar, and a religious studies scholar. She has published an enormous amount of work, and I have to say, I feel humbled by your scholarship. I feel humbled, but let me name only some of them. The greatest achievement of Professor Tokarska-Bakir, at least from my point of view, is this huge 2-volume book, Under a Curse, a social picture of the Kielce pogrom. And I hope that this book will be translated into English, and I understand it next year. Great, because this is a monumental thing, and everybody who works on the Holocaust in Berlin has to know this book. But she published many other things, like in 2019, Pogrom Cries, Essays on Historical Anthropology in Poland, 1939-1946. And quite recently, I believe several months ago, like weeks ago, Jewish Fugitives in the Polish Countryside, 1939-1945, appeared published by Peter Lang. Again, I'm very happy that you could come and participate in this. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy at last being here. And this lecture, it will be about 50 minutes in 9 parts. And the title is Post-War Anti-Jewish Pogroms in Poland 1945-1946, Beyond the Lacrimosa Story. Let me start with an image from Wassily Grossman's novel, Life and Fate. It's the middle of the Second World War. Stalingrad is in flames. A barge moves away from the bank of Volga and someone is heard singing. But, I quote, since there were no human beings in sight, and since everything round about, the earth, the sky, and the Volga was lit up by flame, it seemed as though the war itself were singing this ponderous song. End of the quote. This image is with me whenever I try to understand post-war Polish pogroms, Europe's last mass assaults against the Jews. That's because just as war scenes in Grossman's book, so too does every pogrom tell its own story. In a way, microhistory resembles psychoanalysis here. The researcher waits until the patient begins to talk on their own, except this waiting, which is filled with research, is not taking place next to a couch, but in the archives instead. Sigmund Freud wrote in his diary, I quote, I learned to restrain speculative tendencies and to follow the unforgettable advice of my master Charcot, to look at the same things again and again until they themselves begin to speak. In order, however, for a pogrom to start speaking, one needs to make room for its message. Talem vidi, quelem capere potui. You can see only as much as you can take in, contain. What can be found there is indicated by the subtitles of my books, a social portrayal of the Kielce pogrom and the Kraków pogrom, a choral story. The latter idea was inspired by Svetlana Alexievich, whose series of choral novels covers the major events that took place in the USSR in the second half of the 20th century. My protagonists are not just the pogrom victims, but also the perpetrators, soldiers and policemen, clerks, furnace stokers, and cleaning ladies, janitors, street vendors, storekeepers, barbers, mailmen, chauffeurs, chimney sweeps, waiters, coachmen, and cafe singers. Their stories are composed of a massive quantity of unpredictable details, which has been rightly described as giant fingers. It takes indefinite time and patience to find them, but it is worthwhile. They sometimes have the power of revelation as opposed to stereotype, which dismisses all questions with a single gesture. And why I dedicate so much time to the perpetrators of the scum on the earth. Focusing exclusively on victim groups can lead to their fetishization, their essentialization. Violence should be seen within a larger social context because it is not the victims, but the persecuting society that we seek. I refer here to the redefinition of assimilation by British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, who, instead of discussing the assimilating aspirants and their features being often used to justify injustice, shifted to a focus on the persecuting society that was demanding the assimilation. Part 2. On the pogrom on Kazimierz in Kraków in August 1945. Kazimierz is the name of what was the Jewish quarter before the Second World War. Speaking about the Kraków pogrom, I would like to start by the psychological situation of a 58-year-old Róża Berger, who was killed, shot through the door of her apartment at Wolnica Square number 4. A few months before, she returned from Auschwitz with her family. The Bergers came back to their own apartment that in the meantime had been appropriated by the Lach family, a Polish family of collaborationists. Looking at the register of the inhabitants of the real estate establishment at Wolnica Square 4, with this event in mind, may allow for a new interpretation of Roman Polanski's movie, The Tenant. Perhaps it is not a story about a deepening vortex of madness, but a study of alienation and growing anti-Semitic hostility towards people who are not supposed to exist anymore. Roman Polanski, as a Holocaust survivor, was present in Kraków at the time of the pogrom. Fewer sources have been preserved on the Kraków than on the Kielce pogrom. None of the following trials were public, and the sentences that were passed were disproportionate to the wrongs inflicted. The outbreak of the riots took the authorities by surprise, not only in terms of the force of the anti-Semitism, but also due to the cracks that it revealed in the newly constructed communist apparatus. It was clear at once that the citizens' militia, the communist era police force, and the communist Polish army had been involved. All traces of that involvement began to be effaced, with the guilty parties being dismissed and those compromised eliminated. The task I set myself largely involved tracking down that effacement, those dismissals, and those eliminations. I had to connect the gaps in the documentation in such a way as to create a net in which to catch the concealed information. Archival research in almost every militia officer and Polish soldier in Krakow produced a vast amount of ostensibly superfluous information, something akin to mass service, which only yields any meaning once they take on statistical significance. Accordingly, the Kraków pogrom can be represented as a network map consisting of nearly 1,000 nodes, addresses of the pogrom victims, of the pogrom actors, information of the pre- and post-war biographies, the membership of military and party organizations, their spouses and children, what they did, their shopping, what they read and what they ate, and where they worked, prayed, and spent their leisure time. Now, I am literally able to bury Kazimierz in all these data, meaning that at some point of my query, a critical mass was attained that brought to light a hitherto invisible network of horizontal connections going transversely across communist and anti-communist institutions. It came as no surprise that the structure of these networks proved to follow kinship and neighborhood relationships, as well as an affinity of wartime vicissitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes, and personal politics. The mass nature of this data permitted observation of migration processes during the war and in the aftermath. Firstly, following the deportation of the Jewish Poles to the Podgórze ghetto in 1941, the influx of ethnic Poles into Kazimierz, then the post-war returns of the survivors, the difficult coexistence with their neighbors, and after the pogrom, the departure of almost all of them. As I said, this research revealed incredible cracks and differences within the communist apparatus, which combined to form an image of a weak, dysphoric authority. While in Kielce in 1946, we uncover a rivalry between the citizens' militia and the secret police. In Kraków pogrom, the upper echelons of these two institutions were still cooperating, but their rank and file were consistently sabotaging their work, revealing the weak roots of the new system. Acting in opposition to both institutions is the degenerate rabble that was the local Polish army who plundered shoulder to shoulder with the looting detachment of the Jedwabne. The most valuable documentation that I unearthed during my work were the files of photographs of pogrom participants archived in the Institute for National Remembrance Archive and the volumes of the investigation into the underground units commanded by notorious warlord Józef Kuraś-Ogień. They offer partial confirmation of conjecture as to the evolution of the anti-Jewish violence, which after the sluggish Kraków pogrom trials began to spill over beyond the city boundaries and into the highland regions of the south. This green follow-up testifies to the bankruptcy of the hopes harbored by the communists who, like every Polish ruling power, attempted to turn a blind eye to the rampant anti-Semitism. As soon as we uncovered the connections between the pogrom perpetrators and the units under Ogień, the highly complex district of Kazimierz, with its web of streets and alleys, at once becomes illuminated as if by a powerful spotlight. Now it becomes clear that the group subordinated to Ogień, as well as the anti-Comintern self-defense that in April 1946 killed Stanisław Abrahamer and Zofia Szajko, as well as Phil Goldblum and others, were a dispersed form of continuation of the Kraków pogrom. The figures speak for themselves. While the pogrom itself claimed at most 4 lives, the looting and the further murders by underground fighters subordinated to Ogin, as many as 300. Part 3, a bigger picture. As I embarked on my long-term project 15 years ago, I started with the Kielce massacre on July 4th, 1946, after which over 200,000 Jews left Poland. It is the subject of my book Cursed, which is to be published in English by Cornell University Press next year. Now, the Sea Serpent, microhistory of the Kraków pogrom in August 1945 is almost completed, while the pogrom in Rzeszów in June that same year lies yet ahead. As you see, I'm moving backwards from July 46 to August 45 to June 45, because I believe that if something is a repeatable phenomenon, its meaning becomes revealed only in the finale, such as the Jews' panic escape from Poland after the Kielce pogrom. Replicability is a safeguard against subjectivity, as Bruno Latour says in Pandora's Vault. During the remaining time, I would like to tell you more about a few selected recurring elements that I have discovered in these 3 pogroms, in Kielce, in Kraków, and in Rzeszów. Before we attempt a close-up on the subject, let me place it in a broader perspective. And that is a sequence of several dozen pogroms between 1943 and 1947 in Eastern Europe and Asia. It may sound incredible, but the earliest ones took place in 1943 and 1944 in the Soviet Union without as much as a trace of German inspiration. Subsequently, following on the heels of the Red Army marching toward Berlin, they spread throughout Ukraine, Slovakia, and Hungary, and finally found a stable place in Poland. Before the Holocaust was actually over, the old war against the Jews had flared up again. Now I skip description of the Russian pogroms and Ukrainian pogroms. Part 4, provocation. The post-war assault on the Jews was more than the contemporaries could wrap their minds around. It did not fit with the humanitarian self-image cultivated by each of the nations on whose behalf the war perpetrators were tried at Nuremberg, which is why the post-war pogroms met with denial from the start. That denial was expressed through the word provocation, which has until recently been used by all the narrators of this history, including historians. It was used by the Soviet and Polish communist authorities to camouflage their own indolence and reluctance to confront the widespread anti-Semitism. With this end in mind, pogrom provocations were attributed to the reactionary agents, while attacking Jews was considered tantamount to attacking the people's government and democracy itself. And then, whenever a reference to a pogrom provocation was made by the anti-communist resistance movement, they suggested it was the NKVD who had agitated someone against the Jews in order to accuse Polish people of anti-Semitism, or they claimed that the NKVD had been removing the traces of Jewish ritual murders in an attempt to blame them on the Poles. Having researched the pogroms in Kielce and Kraków, I can assure you that there is no evidence whatsoever of any provocation by the Soviets or the Polish communist authorities in the unfolding of the post-war pogroms. Unfortunately, there is no proving a negative statement in the science of logic, which is why my assertion cannot be proved properly. All that can be done is wait for someone who is of different opinion to point to evidence to support it, but so far no one has succeeded in doing so. The Soviets were horrific occupiers and definitely deserve to be judged harshly, but it would be an error to blame them for something they didn't do. Had it not been for the Red Army soldiers who in June 1945 stood guard as Jews gathered inside so-called People's House in Rzeszów and then escorted them to the railroad station, the Rzeszów pogrom would have escalated into a bloodbath. Had it not been for the detachment of the 6th Motorized Regiment of the Internal Security Corps under Lieutenant Colonel Łakishin, stationed at Skawinska Street, the pogrom in Kraków would also have reached a gory finale. The 42 victims in the Kielce pogrom 1 year later were the outcome of the ban on leaving the barracks imposed on the Soviet troops by their command during the event. Fearing that the information might provoke an insurgency, the Russians had decided not to meddle in the Polish affairs this time. Part 5, Blood Libel and Judeo-Communism. Now, I would like to elaborate on the sparks that kindled the Polish pogroms. In all cases, it was an accusation of the Jews as perpetrators of ritual murder. In Kraków and Kielce alike, we have 2 real boys, an 12-year-old Antoś Nijaki and 8-year-old Himel, claiming that Jews had kidnapped or attempted to kidnap them to use them as an ingredient for baking matzah. In Rzeszów, such fantasizing boys were replaced by a silent dead girl, a victim of a sexual crime, of whose death a shochet or ritual slaughterer named Jonas Landesman was accused and subsequently spent several horrific months in jail. A sadistic fantasy envisioning a little girl hanging with her head downward like an animal slaughtered by a shochet haunted the Polish people's imagination for years to come. This begs the question, why did the blood libel, absorbed from today's perspective, have the power to bring people into the streets immediately after the war? Under the pretext of protecting children from barbarians, blood libel was entrenched within the primary Polish dichotomy or dominant cleavage, as Max Laxman used to describe it, between the Jewish and non-Jewish Poles, originally religious, subsequently political, and nowadays consisting of the similar understanding of morals. In my country, this polarization continues to operate as an identity matrix, not only powerful of itself, but also capable of generating new discourses, such as that of normalcy defined as sexual or gender correctness, or in abortion wars. This is the context in which one needs to consider the anti-LGBTQ+ slogans recently propagated by some of the leading Polish politicians and the Catholic Church. Why is this so? Because folklore becomes the subconsciousness of a nation. In Christian Europe, Jews were pictured as adversaries for so many centuries that today any adversary is endowed with the symbolic features of the Jew. Part 6, Court Jews and Wojnica, License to Kill. After the last war, Jews were also easier to attack than the powerful Soviets. When we look at the year 1945 from a long-term perspective, we will notice that attacking Jews instead of communists is an episode in the long history of the connotation of Jews and political power. The Jewish communists who became the communist government's buffer after the war would thus be a continuation of the tradition of court Jews. The beginning of these connotations are embedded in the exclusion of Jews in the Middle Ages, resulting from a ban of the admission to professions and occupations involving either ownership of land or carrying arms. The monarch's courts were the only power capable of guaranteeing their safety. The earliest recorded case of the court being attacked vicariously through the Jews was the 1190 pogrom in York, England, where in the atmosphere of collective hysteria incited in connection with the Third Crusade, the families of the local tax collectors were slain. It was around the same time that a structural outline of anti-Jewish violence emerged, which later in the 19th century became inseparable from the concept of wolnica, which literally means in Polish free for all, but could be better translated as a license to kill. Specifically, this Polish word was used to describe rumors, whether spread on purpose or produced by misunderstanding, of the authorities' actual support for meting out popular justice to the Jews. In 1190, when the Jews of York locked themselves up in a fortress, a royal constable demanded access. For fear of treason, however, the gates of the castle remained closed. The constable turned to the sheriff of Yorkshire for help, who arrived with a detachment of armed men. As William of Newborough relates, the sheriff's order to besiege the castle deluded all the workers and young men in the town, as well as a large crowd of countrymen, into the belief that an onslaught on the Jews would have royal approval. The wolnica motive surfaced so often in anti-Jewish violence that over time it became a differentia specifica of the pogrom, sometimes defined as a collusion between the people and the powerful lords of the state administration. I skipped the quote from Jan Grabowski about wolnica, and now part 7, cooptation. It is exactly this element of wolnica that comes through in all 3 post-war pogroms. It is connected with the participation of militiamen, soldiers, and other public order services reporting to the communist government, many of whom, instead of defending the Jews, attacked and robbed them, which the onlookers interpreted as the authorities condoning violence. Thus, the siege of the Jewish Committee building in Kielce started with the indolence of the militia patrols that had been sent to check on the report given by 8-year-old Jedwabne. First, the militiamen walked through the city and talked to people about a boy abducted by Jews, and subsequently, to the accompaniment of the mob's clamor, they conducted a search combined with plundering in the house at number 7 Planter Street. A similar bravado characterized the conduct of the officers of the second station of civic militia at Wolnica Square in Krakow when performing a search in the synagogue at Miodowa Street in August 1945. A question arises: how should we understand the presence of such men in communist institutions, which, according to Judeo-communism theory, had supposedly been taken over by the Jews? We can answer this question again using the archival resources of the Institute for National Remembrance. Over 80% of the civic militia personnel in Krakow had a history as soldiers in the Home Army or the National Armed Forces, meaning the largest Polish underground resistance organizations during the war. Only about 10% had been members of pro-communist People's Army. If we are to believe the statistics 100% of the political educational officers in Krakow in 1946 were former functionaries of Blue Police, meaning the police force reporting to the occupying German forces and aiding them in conducting the Holocaust. We can assert without doubt that in Kielce and Krakow alike, the post-war police was an institution which hired its own political adversaries as mercenaries. This was possible because everyone was taken on indiscriminately. Anyone who would report for duty, and many did show up in the hopes of avoiding conscription into military service. This is how the opponents of the new political system were given uniforms and weapons which they turned against the Jews. I skip the description. The simplified version of Poland's post-war history is suggestive of a dichotomy, a foreign imposed apparatus of power versus a rebellious society. Why is this description false? Because it ignores the presence of a contracted group of mercenaries. A mental fixation on the presence of Jews in the uniformed services prevents one from noticing petty officers of the Home Army and the National Armed Forces, who by joining the civic militia became its mainstay. They continued to be that mainstay, even when the communist government scrambled for nationalist legitimization, pushed the Jewish Poles out of the country after 1968. This is the situation we are dealing with in post-war Krakow, where the core of the civic militia personnel is formed by the former soldiers of the special unit for sabotage and executions of the Krakow Home Army called Zgrupowanie Jedwabne. It's surprise. Its members were not some second-rate resistant fighters, but rather sabotage experts of the caliber of Jan Grabowski, who now has a street named after him in Krakow. Part 8, about the Jews shooting from the windows. But in 1945 and 1946, another pogrom spark, no less effective than accusing Jews of ritual murder, was the accusation of possessing weapons and of firing them at Polish officers. During the Krakow pogrom, that rumor was a potent cause of forced entry into Jewish dwellings, which were then looted under the pretense of police search. In generational terms, there is no doubt that even though the events of Krakow were the work of 20-something, it was perpetrated under the aegis of people born in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were the ones who passed on to the young the know-how of the pogroms of 1918 and 1919, complete with the motive of shooting at Polish officers. Some of them had absorbed it when serving in General Himel's Blue Army. A search for weapons also preceded the massacre during the Kielce pogrom. What happened in between, though, was common robbery. The witnesses talked about soldiers and militiamen dressing up in clothes that they had stolen from the Jews. For example, Hanka Albert, the wife of the head of Kielce's Ihud kibbutz, testified at some point that she had said to such a soldier, "But you are wearing my husband's shirt." Historians who are still attached to the Soviet provocation hypothesis have perceived the soldiers' practice of putting on such clothes as proof of a Soviet conspiracy, while it was no more than regular looting. In every story, there is something happening behind the scenes, that needs to be noticed in order to grasp the essence of what actually happened. The same goes for a search for weapons motive. I finally understood it when I ran into the expression Jewish pathbreaking, meaning Jewish thieves, and the description of the robberies in the town of Stry, perpetrated under the laws of the Russian occupying administration during the First World War. And this is description by Józef Białynia-Hołodewski. I quote, "In Stry, the pogrom of the Jews was arranged by the commander of the convoy of Austrian prisoners of war. Namely, he turned to the onlookers gathered in the suburbs with the question whether they know what a Jewish prazdnik was. After receiving a negative answer, he issued an order to a soldier who then disappeared in a side alley. Suddenly, a shot could be heard. 'Oh, you son of the bitches,' the commander yelled at the Jews. 'It's you who's shooting at us. Hands up.' And thereupon, under the pretense of searching for weapons, the soldiers took to emptying Jewish pockets of money and watches and combing through the nearby Jewish dwellings. Soon they came back laden with shovels, sweets, and sitting down to gorge and dine together with the prisoners. They announced conclusively, 'Now, this is what you call a Jewish prazdnik.'" Part 9, about Jewish self-defense. I'm getting close to my conclusion, which is why it's time for me to explain the title of my lecture. Some time ago, Jewish historians voiced a postulate to move away from the Lacrimosa story formula, meaning a history of the Jews told in a teary, bemoaning way, boiling down to a repetitive enumeration of persecutions. Hannah Arendt welcomed this postulate in introduction to her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. My version of the history of the pogroms does not refrain from a litany of repetitions that she resented, if only for the fact that they are the most effective in reproducing the rhythm of mythical thinking and anti-Jewish violence. But the history that I am reconstructing has nothing to do with a Lacrimosa story. What I consider to be my greatest discovery is the documentation of the structures of spontaneous Jewish self-defense in each of these three pogroms. This self-defense was initiated by various actors who had drawn conclusions from the prior Jewish defenselessness. I will now outline this history of agency of the persecuted as briefly as possible, and again starting at the end. In the Kielce pogrom, the Jewish self-defense is confined to a single enterprising person. On the morning of July 4th, 1946, Lieutenant Albert Grünbaum, an employee of the Public Security Office in Kielce and veteran of the Spanish Civil War, heard some disconcerting news in town. Jews were said to have kidnapped and held aboard in the Jewish Committee building. On the day preceding the pogrom, however, the boy reputedly managed to escape and came back home, causing a sensation. On hearing this, Lieutenant Grünbaum hastened to the Jewish Committee building, outside which people had already begun to gather. Had it not been for his stance during this siege, he called for backup, gathered the Jews in two barricaded rooms, and told the others to hide in the attic, the number of casualties would certainly have been greater. Albert Grünbaum managed to survive that day. He was evacuated from the building when, possibly incited by an uncle of Himel, the workers of Ludwików iron factory came there to mete out justice in the spirit of collective blame. The number of casualties came to 42. Grünbaum lived only 1 month longer than those victims. On August 6, 1946, he died in an ambush set by the underground forces near Białobrzegi. I have already mentioned the Rzeszów pogrom. Jews were saved there by way of gathering all of them in the people's house and by evacuating them immediately from the city. The operation was organized by another resourceful veteran of the Spanish War, Roman Orłowski, known before as Heuser Grosse, deputy commander of the civic militia in Rzeszów. And finally, Kraków. Here, the story of Jewish self-defense has two stages, which I have dubbed as the first and second defenses of Kazimierz, respectively. The first defense of Kazimierz took place in 1919, when the Kraków Jews felt threatened by General Schaller's army, known for their inclination to cut Jewish men's beards. Somewhat earlier, in agreement with the authorities of the newly independent Poland, the Jews of Kraków formed the Jewish Volunteer Reserve, an organization of veterans of the Austrian army prepared to defend the city from unruly soldiers. The organizers operated legally for less than a week and was dissolved. The organization operated legally for less than a week and was dissolved, but its leaders, Bertolt Fass and Jakub Bilik, moved it underground and hid their weapons in the Kehila building at Skawinska Street. Thanks to their foresight, the people of Kazimierz were not completely defenseless when the pogrom began in June 1919. The second defense of Kazimierz took place on August 11, 1945, when riots broke out outside the Kupa synagogue, followed by looting. A group of more than a dozen security officers and civic militia servicemen of Jewish background tried to contain the pogrom on their own. We know the names of all these individuals, the circumstances of their arrival in Kazimierz, and who they arrested. They owed the effectiveness to exactly what they were hated for, the security office and militia uniforms. What on other occasions opened doors into Jewish dwellings before militiamen turned pogromstic enabled those corps to save lives. This group included the couple formed by my two main protagonists in my book, Lieutenant Tadeusz Grabowski, who would die the following year in Maków Podhalański at the hands of the underground Ogień fighters, and his wife, Irena Myczynska, a civilian prosecutor of the secret police, UB, who conducted the inquest after the pogrom. While the names of Jakub Bilik and Bertolt Fass probably did not mean anything to them, it was this group who succeeded in turning the 1919 idea of Jewish self-defense into reality in 1945. If they had not been in Kazimierz at noon that day, the steering of the crowd, as was a pogrom described in Jan Grabowski in Old Polish, would have escalated into a massacre. The post-war pogroms were, of course, not the first ones to feature Jewish self-defense. The 20th century series opened with the Odessa pogrom of 1905, as described by Robert Weinberg. At the time, the National Committee of Jewish Self-Defense made an alliance with student and Bolshevik groups. The largest numbers of casualties were usually caused by pogroms that nobody expected, such as one in November 1918 in Lviv, now Lviv and Ukraine. Now, we would have never found out about the Jewish self-defense but for nitpicking the details in painstaking, time-consuming, expensive archival searches, or in other words, if the Krakow pogrom had not wished to tell us about itself. This new knowledge destroys the Judeo-communism stereotype, which continues to be used by numerous Polish historians in their explication of the pogroms. Judeo-communism is a screen picture that affirms the listeners in their foreknowledge, a picture that enables them not to see what is there. The notion of Jewish self-defense, on the other hand, enhances the shared reality by adding to it something that has been absent, expanding the horizon of the imaginable. Thank you for your attention.